we're here with another mid-month wrap-up. So it's halfway through September. I thought I'd check in and let you guys know how our reading month was going. I've just done the math and we're currently on just over 3,300 pages this month already, which I'm really, really chuffed with. Doesn't look as though we're going to get our TBR done because our TBR was up on like 8,500, and if we're halfway through the month we're looking at like 6,600, but that's good because that's about what we did last month, so as long as we're kind of averaging, that's good. Yeah, I guess we'll just get on with it. As you know, probably know if you've seen our other videos, we are doing Bookoplathon at the moment, so I'm gonna do what the role was, what we read for it, what we thought of it, to give you more of an idea of why we're reading these books, because it's been a bit of a diverse month so far. There's been like a classic, there's been some middle grade, there's been some historical, it's been all over the place. Yeah, so let's get on with it, I guess. So I'll start off with the books that I've read with Sean this month, and the first one of those that we read together was a book with a light cover, which for that we chose 13 Stories by Jonathan Sims. We started this one last month and finished it off in the first kind of week of August, because this is 13 short stories based in the same building. So the premise is that there's this building that, like, the front half is the rich and famous people. They've got massive suites, they've got the concierges are on 24/7, they've got all the security. But in the back of the same building, it's like the rich people, it's like really bad building, all of their security systems are broken. So you get a very diverse range of characters. You've got people who are like tech entrepreneurs who have made like millions. Yeah, my brain is starting to fall out a little bit. You've got like the tech entrepreneur who's made the home help system that ends up like taking over his life. You've got the girl who's working the dead end job doing the night shifts, and she's kind of coming home and getting like the fear of that because of stories that her mother's told her over the years. You've got like lawyers who are involved in the running of the building, journalists who are investigating the building, a really nice array of characters. But the problem with it is that some of the stories are much more compelling than others. The first half I really, really enjoyed, and that had a lot of the standout stories, but towards the second half of the novel it kind of started getting a little bit repetitive. There were some voices that were very similar, so it was hard to tell them apart, and you didn't get as individual of an experience with them, because you were like, oh, this is similar to this thing that just happened. I really love the way that Jonathan Sims linked it all together, because there are like little threads that are pulled all the way through. Like he references the plumber in 3 or 4 of the first stories, and then the plumber's viewpoint comes in to one of the stories later on in the collection. So I thought that was really well done. But the payoff just doesn't quite. It doesn't. Oh, I don't know. She's really putting me off. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite pay off at the end, because the last story focuses on the person who has like developed the tower. He lives up in the penthouse. He's like this millionaire who's known across the globe for like exploiting workers and dangerous working conditions and things like that. So he gathers all of the other 12 people at his apartment for a dinner party. And you know that all the way through because each of the individual characters, their story ends with this dinner party invitation, but the payoff just isn't quite there, which was a shame because I was really excited to see how it was going to end, and then I felt a little bit deflated when I got to the end of it. We ended up giving this one 3 stars. It's a very solid, it's a debut novel from a guy who normally writes podcasts, so I can see how he'd be able to get the individual voices really well, and I can see how he can link it in quite nicely, but I'm just not quite sure whether it works in long form. The next book that I'm going to talk about is Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, which we read for a translated book. Apparently this was actually our first roll, and I just got those rolls the wrong way around. So we actually went translated, light cover. So we read them in this order, but we rolled them in the other order. This is a mess. I'm trying. So Metamorphosis is a short story about a guy who wakes up and he is a bug. he's stuck in his bed and he can't get up, and he needs to get to work, but he can't get out of bed, and his family are all panicking because he's not going to work and they need him to earn money for them. And then his boss kind of turns up and is like, why aren't you at work? And then he opens the door and he's like, because I'm a bug. This is why I'm not at work. I don't think I'm intelligent enough to understand it, because I enjoyed it. Like, it was a fascinating story. Guy wakes up, is a bug, what happens next? But I'm guessing it was like a big allegory for something else, and I'm just not sure whether I quite understood it. I thought it was kind of like the death of the single working family, because like it goes from the guy who turns into the bug is the one who's like making the money for the family, and then all of a sudden like his father needs to get a job and his sister needs to get a job because he's no longer able to provide for them. So I thought it was kind of saying like if the main breadwinner becomes incapacitated through like war, if things like that, what do you do? How do you adapt to that? But that might not be it at all. That's what I got from it, and I thought it was really clever. But if that's not actually what it means, this is why I don't read a lot of classics. It's only 62 pages, so it was a nice quick one, and it is translated, so that was ideal because it hit the prompt off. We'd originally picked The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. That's like 600 pages. We didn't think we were going to get through it, but after a quick Google, we found out the Metamorphosis also was. We're thinking of possibly reading the rest of the short story collection at some point, either this month or next month, because we've only read the Metamorphosis story from this one. So it'll be interesting to see how Franz Kafka's other writing works, because a lot of the short stories are like literally just a page. Like, that's just a page, and that's a whole story. These are whole stories, and they are like half page each. We'll see how that goes. The next prompt that we rolled was a middle grade, and for that we read Potkin and Stubbs by Sophie Green. This is for middle grade monthly, so this is the book that they picked this month, the first book in the Potkin and Stubbs series, and we thought we'd give it a go. I was expecting this to be my new favourite book just based off of the cover, because this is like exactly my aesthetic, but it ended up being a little bit underwhelming, which was surprising. So this follows a girl called Little Potkin who wants to be a journalist, and she's investigating mysterious goings on in her hometown. And she bumps into a boy at the bus station, and he is a ghost. Yeah, so that gives her something to investigate. She's got this guy who he can't remember his name, he can't remember his story. He says he has a missing persons case for her, and he says, I am the missing person. I'm dead, and someone must be missing me. Which it's an interesting concept, and I think for middle grade especially, like some of the things in here are a bit darker than you'd be expecting from middle grade, and it's got like a noir setting. And it just rains constantly, and so it's a lot darker and gloomier and grittier than you'd expect with most middle grades. But I think that the mystery itself was just a little bit too predictable. Like, even looking at it, kind of trying to take yourself out of reading it as an adult reader and trying to look at it as middle grade, I just think that the foreshadowing was very heavy handed. It was kind of like hitting you over the head with a brick at points, and even when I was younger, that was something I really did not like when I was reading. So I think that's something that would have annoyed me even if I'd read this 10 years ago if it had been out then. I'm glad that I read it, and I'm definitely looking forward to carrying on with the rest of the series, because the setting is brilliant and the characters are great, but just not totally and utterly convinced by this first book. So this one ended up getting 3 stars. We then rolled a standalone book, and for that we read Loveless by Alyce Oseman. So Loveless is a story following a girl called Georgia who goes to university, and she is using it as kind of an opportunity to discover herself and her sexuality, as she is the girl who's like never been kissed. So she goes to university hoping she's going to meet the love of her life, and she discovers she's actually asexual and a romantic. So she has to kind of come to terms with this herself, and then has to explain it to her friends and let them come to terms with it and like what it means for her life. I think it's brilliant that books about ace folk are being published, because it's something that I've been asking for years, like literally years. I went to a book event with David Levithan and Lisa Williamson, and I said, like, are either of you going to write books with asexual characters, because I feel like there's not enough representation, and they knew that like people were working on things but they didn't have any news of their own. So the fact that it's now possible to like look at the UK way of publishing and say, look, this is an ace lead character in a really big release from a well-known author who is loved across the globe. Like, she's really big in America too, not just in the UK, and I think that is great. But I can't just give it a high rating because I appreciate the representation. And I think that the story was very slow. It's very chunky. This is like Alyce Oseman's thickest book, I think. Like, it's just over 400 pages. And it doesn't need to be. And I know that it's also exploring George's feelings and thoughts about going to university, and that change of circumstance and that kind of point in your life when you're becoming an adult. You're kind of stepping from teenage into adult. It's like the quintessential young adult experience, really. But I just think that it was a bit dry. And I hate saying that because Radio Silence, one of my favourite books, really enjoyed Solitaire as well, but Loveless just didn't quite do it for me. I think it's difficult because asexuality is such a big spectrum, and so many people talk about asexuality in different ways, and so many people identify as ace, but they identify in different ways to other ace folk. And I think it's just difficult to write about something like that because it's never going to be a universal experience, and this seems like a very fixed idea of asexuality, and this is the very kind of traditional stereotypical view of like never going to love people, not interested in sex, very sex averse. And while that is the case for a lot of ace, that being said, I did really like the relationships between Georgia and her friends Pip and Jason, and I thought the focus on friendship being almost more important than romantic relationships is brilliant, and that's something that's really empowering for readers, whether they're ace or whether they're just not that interested in being in a relationship. I think it's something really empowering for young readers to read. And I would have loved reading a book like this when I was younger, because that would have made me feel like I didn't have to try quite as hard with like being in a relationship, with like trying to be like appealing. And I think it's going to do good things in that respect, and I think it's going to do good things for the asexual readers who do relate to this portrayal of asexuality. I just worry that it's not going to be that effective for readers who don't kind of relate to this asexual experience. I haven't really seen many Own Voices reviews for it yet. I'm looking forward to more coming out. The people that I have seen talking about it who are asexual have been very, very excited about it, and I felt very empowered. But I've still got that in the back of my mind that like it could easily go the other way, and especially with like the depiction of bisexuality as well. I'm not too much of a fan of the way that the bisexual character is portrayed as like sleeping around kind of just for the sake of it, and even though that is explored a bit more later in the book, it does seem quite harmful at the beginning, but that's just the way that I kind of felt about it. Yeah, good focus on friendship, good to see asexual representation in like a really big, well pushed release, but not convinced myself, so I think I ended up giving this one 3.5 stars. So now I'll move on to the books that I've read for my Bookoplathon experience, because that's all the books that Sean and I have read together this month so far. So the first book that I read this month was for my ebook or audiobook role, and for that I read You Say It First by Katie Katuno. This follows two teenagers called Meg and Colby. She phones him up as someone who is trying to convince people to register to vote. Colby's not interested at all, and she's phoned up asking for his dad, who actually died by suicide the previous year, so Colby's already kind of on edge and not the happiest when she starts trying to convince him to vote. So they have like quite it's a conversation filled with a lot of friction when they first interact, but Meg feels really guilty about it, so she phones back and she leaves him her number and she says, if you want to call me and talk, like, I'm here. And he does, and then their relationship develops from there. And I think it's definitely an interesting one to be reading a contemporary novel that's like basically just, it's primarily told through these phone conversations. And I don't know about you, but like I hardly ever phone anybody, and the majority of people I know hardly ever talk on the phone either. It's all just texting, messaging, WhatsApp, Facebook. So I loved the way that she decided to make the phone calls be this focus, and the way that you can kind of fall in love with somebody just by talking to them and hearing their voice constantly. You don't even really need to see them, you don't need to always be there. You can have like successful long distance relationships. That was great. I loved the way that Meg was so kind of politically involved and Colby wasn't interested at all, because I think that's a very good message to give to teenagers in this day and age, because at the moment it kind of seems like if you've got even a slightly differing opinion, then you shouldn't really be kind of friends. And I think having such a kind of separation between those characters. I couldn't think of any kind of words there, so I'm just shaking my hands. Having such a separation and such a marked difference between those two characters, and then having them have such a powerful relationship, is really, really good. And I definitely liked that aspect of it. I think I ended up giving this one 4 stars. Like, this was a really enjoyable contemporary. It was a very quick read. Read it in a couple of days, and I thought it was going to take me a lot longer. There were some bits that I wasn't a huge fan of. Like, there's a lot of miscommunication. There's a lot of kind of arguing for the sake of arguing. But then I think some relationships work that way. So it is realistic. It's just not exactly my cup of tea, which is why this isn't a 5-star for me. But I definitely recommend it, especially if you've read Katie Catuno's books before, because this one has more of like a serious focus where it's talking about the political aspects. So the second book that I read myself in September was Alyce Approximately by Jen Bennett. This is another book which is told through a different medium than like face-to-face conversations, as you're following a girl called Bailey is friends with a guy called Alyce online, and they are both film buffs and they love classic film and they talk about it all the time, and Alyce has been trying to convince her to move to where her father lives, which is in the same town as Alyce, because he wants them to meet in real life. Now Bailey doesn't tell Alyce, but she decides to move to be with her father, and she doesn't tell Alyce because she wants to meet him and get to know him as like a surprise. So she doesn't want him to know that it's her, but she wants to kind of scope him out first because she's a bit unsure about meeting a guy online, which reasonable enough. And so she sets out with like a map of the boardwalk, and she's got all the information that Alyce has given her, like the fact that his family has a shop on the boardwalk and he works there, and it has a counter and it has like a churro cart nearby, and there's a local cat. And so Bailey sets out on this journey trying to find Alyce. Now at the same time, she's having trouble with a guy at work who is a security guard, and he's just an asshole. He's like really arrogant and he's full of himself, and they're constantly like warring backwards and forwards. But then she starts to realise that he's got like hidden depths, and she wants to get to know him a bit better, even though it feels like she's almost cheating on Alyce. So she's got this conflict of like between these two guys, which one is she going to end up picking? And now I'm gonna give spoilers. It's pretty predictable already, isn't it? Like, the security guard is Alyce. See, this isn't a surprise, because as soon as she moves, she like bumps into this guy and his friend's being an asshole, and she's like, oh, what an asshole, I don't like either of those guys. And then the next thing, he's the security guard. But it's like, it's literally in the blurb, like, that she is working with a guy that she doesn't know is the guy she's talking to. Like, it's meant to be like a mystery in the story, but it's laid out there in the blurb, and I wouldn't have read the blurb first if I'd known it was going to completely spoil the entire plot. That being said, despite the fact that the whole mystery and all of the suspense was just gone, I loved the way that PTSD was tackled in this book. So both Bailey and I've forgotten his name as well. This proves how impactful it's been if I read it like 2 weeks ago and I've already forgotten both of the main characters' names. I don't know what his name was, and I don't know how to find that easily. Porter. So both Bailey and Porter are suffering with PTSD. So Bailey was involved in a shooting, so she's very affected by loud noises. She's scared of guns. She won't watch films that she knows have like gunfights or gun crime in them. And Porter was attacked by a shark because he does surfing and he had to save his father, and he got caught up in this shark attack. So they both have PTSD in those respects, and I think that's tackled brilliantly. I loved the relationship between them, and I think if it hadn't had the Alyce aspect, it would have been a much better book. So the fact that it's called Alyce Approximately, and Alyce is like the whole plot line that I just really didn't appreciate. If this had just been like girl and guy who work together, hate each other, and then end up falling in love, it would have been a magical story. But then you've got to have like the miscommunication between them, and the fact that she doesn't like opening up to either Porter or Alyce. And I just think that it would be so much better without those aspects. And Jen Bennett's writing is so good, and she does contemporary so well. Like, Starry Eyes is one of my favourite books ever. And that was the first Jen Bennett I read, and I think I might have made a mistake, because I might have started off on, like, the best one. Because I've been excited to read this one for so long, and it just didn't live up to my expectations. I ended up giving it 3.5 stars, because as I said, like, the portrayal of the PTSD was really good. And, like, the actual kind of chemistry between Bailey and Porter worked perfectly. There was just too much else going on that didn't need to be there. So the next roll that I made was for a book set in the past, and for that I read I, Ada by Julia Gray, which was kindly sent to me by Anderson Press, so thank you so much, Anderson, for sending this my way. For a girl who isn't interested in STEM subjects and doesn't read historical fiction, this was actually really, really enjoyable. So if you don't know who Ada Lovelace is, she's actually Ada Byron. So Lord Byron's daughter, Ada, then changed her surname to become Ada Lovelace and then became the world's first computer programmer. This is a story set in the kind of early 1800s, following her teenage years as she discovers more about her father and about herself, and she is interested in science and maths and discovers as much about the world using those lenses as she can. My only issue with this one is that it feels as though Ada's story starts as the book ends. I know that Julia Gray wanted to focus on her teenage years, but I feel as though the more interesting aspects would have been literally just afterwards. Like, there's just one chapter that kind of tells you about Ada's adult life, and then there's like the little afterword that like fills you in on what she did later on in her life. But that's the bit of the story I would have liked to have read. And if this had been 100 to 200 pages longer and it had really explored those aspects as well, I would have enjoyed it a lot more. But the fact that it was so short and it seemed to tell a very focused story that wasn't that interesting, that was what didn't end up appealing to me. I did feel like I learnt a lot, which is all you can really ask with historical fiction that's based on like a real character, because I didn't actually know that Lord Byron's daughter Ada was Ada Lovelace. I'd never twigged in my head that they were one and the same. So I loved learning that, and I also felt as though I learnt more about Byron, and I've always been interested in him because of like being Shelley adjacent. Like, I'm interested in Mary Shelley and Percy Bysshe Shelley, so it's nice to read a bit more about kind of like their friend and his family. I would recommend this if you're a fan of historical fiction, because it does have a lot of like the traditional historical fiction elements. Like, you're exploring the kind of countryside and you're seeing the settings that you're familiar with now, but through that lens of like 200 years ago. But it just wasn't really the book for me, which was a shame. The next role that I got was to randomise my TBR, and with this one I got The Dark Light by Julie Bell. I wish I hadn't, is all I can really say. If you have this book, just put it in the bin. Just don't bother with it. So it tells the story of like a little cult on an island, and Alyce has gotten in trouble for burning down someone's house, which is explored in the briefest possible section right in the first chapter, and you never find out who, and you never find out why, and you don't get to explore her backstory, which is number one piece of the bullshit. So Alyce goes out to this island, and she is meant to be kind of taking part with this religious cult and looking to change her ways by finding Jesus or God, or this crazy cult leader's like taking it all over. I don't know, it gets a bit confusing. So Alyce has always been really self-absorbed, she's never cared about anybody, and then she meets Rebecca, and despite the fact that they have like zero things in common, and despite the fact that they have only spoken for like 2 days, all of a sudden Alyce would do anything for her, and Alyce cares so much about Rebecca. And that's number two piece of the bullshit, is the insta-love. Just knock it off. It's so corny and it's so flimsy, and you don't know either of the characters, and then they don't know each other, and then you're supposed to care about their relationship. That's not happening. And then Rebecca, who has never had any kind of sapphic thoughts in her life, is suddenly like, I want to kiss Alyce. I'll do anything for Alyce. I'm going to give up Jesus for Alyce. Which is number three piece of the bullshit. That's not how real life works. If you've been indoctrinated into a cult your entire life, if you've been born here and you've been raised here and you've been following this religion for 16 years with no idea what's going on in the outside world, all you've got to do is kind of like convert people to your way of thinking. You're not going to drop it like that because you meet a girl. That's just stupid. And then, this is where it gets spoilery. I don't care. It's a bad book. Don't read it anyway. So, basically, Alyce gets, like, tortured by the leader of the cult. And so she becomes, like, uber religious. And then Rebecca gets killed. Because why wouldn't we want to kill your gays in a book that's already filled with 4 pieces of bullshit? Honestly, it just makes me so angry. Because this could have been really, really good. Like, ooh, like, crazily religious person starts discovering her sexuality. Like, if it had moved slower and if the relationship had been more convincing and if it hadn't been so flimsy, it could have been a really powerful book. It wasn't. It was bland and awful, and I wish I hadn't read it, and I knew I was going to hate it, and I knew there was a reason it was in my top 10 lowest rated on Goodreads. I ended up giving it 1 star. I think that was generous, and I'm so mad that I wasted my time on this. If you're interested in reading books about cults and you want a book that's actually got well-developed characters, read After the Fire by Will Hill. Because that one, about a cult, very, very intense focus on this cult and the way that you kind of get indoctrinated and the way that you have to break down your beliefs to be able to move through them and move on with your life. Read that instead. It's way better. Don't bother with the Dark Light. Just don't. Just don't. So the next book that I read was for the Roll of Light cover, for which I read A Dark Shade of Magic by Victoria Schwab. And now, thankfully, from a 1 star, we're going to a 4.5 star. I loved this. I knew I was going to. I don't know why I was so nervous to try it. I think that Lila is one of the greatest characters I've ever read. She's just obsessed with, like, collecting all these weapons and, like, having fancy schmancy coats, and she wants to be a pirate. Like, she wants to get a ship and she wants to have a pirate hat. She's so badass, and I love her. And I love Kel as well, because Kel is... I'm assuming you all know what A Dark Shade of Magic is about by now, because I'm one of the last people in the entire world to read this book, which is why I'm just diving straight in on my thoughts of it. But basically, there's like 4 Londons. There's Grey London, Red London, White London, and Black London. And Black London is completely out of commission. Bad shit's gone down there. Lila is from Grey London, which is our London, because we have no magic and we're boring. Red London is where Kel's from, and Red London's really cool. Like, the Thames is red, it's really awesome. And then White London's ruled by these evil twins. So, that tells you enough, don't go there. And Kel is an Antari, which means he can, like, hop backwards and forwards between all the Londons. And he takes Lila with him to do a mission thing. But I loved it. So, Kel has such an interesting story, because he's one of these Antari, but he's also like an adopted member of the royal family, so he's got like that internal conflict of like, he feels like he's his own species and his own person, and that he doesn't relate to them at all because he's got this kind of ability to travel between the realms that no one else has. But then he's also got like his brother Ree is like the member of the royal family, and even though they're not biologically brothers, they feel like brothers, and so he still has that need to be there for him, and he still wants to be like loyal to this world, and he's like trying his hardest even though he's not sure that he belongs there. And there's just so many dynamics to this story that I absolutely adored. The single reason I didn't give it 5 stars was because it feels so much like a standalone, and I can't see where it's going to go, and I'm not sure how quickly I'm going to carry on with the series, because the end of it wraps up so neatly. It feels like a standalone. Everything is resolved. Like, the big bads are defeated. The day is saved. We're moving on with our lives filled with happiness and joy. And I just wasn't expecting that. I like it because it means I don't feel pressured to carry on the series as quickly as possible because I'm going to forget what happened, because it's very self-contained. But I'm just not sure where it's going to go, and that makes me a bit apprehensive. And that's why I'm like, I'm not sure whether it was planned to be a series before the first one was written, or whether it was meant to be a standalone and then got expanded. But that's the one thing that I'm not too convinced on, that it all just felt a bit too like neat and tidy with the bow all tied up and all the ends sorted out. And I'm not a huge fan of series starters that package things up so neatly. But that's my own personal thing. If you love that, then this is definitely the book for you, and I'm going to carry on with the series, and I'm really, really glad I finally kicked myself up the arse and read this one. So the last of my roles I'm going to talk about today is my community shelf role, for which I pulled out Set in Space and chose Brightly Burning by Alexa Donne. This is a Jane Eyre retelling set in space, and I think it would be more accurate to say it's like Jane Eyre meets the 100, because there's like talk about the fleet being decommissioned and whether Earth will be hospitable, and whether you'll be able to kind of go down and like go back onto Earth after this ice age that caused everybody to flee to space in the first place. And that is the far more interesting aspect. The Jane Eyre bit of it is just really boring, and this is coming from somebody who didn't like Jane Eyre. If I'd read Jane Eyre before I requested this book, I wouldn't have requested this book, because it's a Jane Eyre retelling. So I knew when I picked it out it wasn't going to be exactly my cup of tea. But I ended up giving it 3 stars, so it's better than it could have been. If you know anything about Jane Eyre, you know the plot of the story. Governess falls in love with rich guy. There's some conflict between them. It's hard for them to sort their relationship out, but they eventually do. There's a happy ending. That's all you can really ask for in like a YA fantasy romance. But yeah, just not exactly my cup of tea, so a good old 3 stars for this one. So that is the 10 books that we've read so far in the month of September. Considering we're only 2 weeks in, I'm feeling pretty proud that we've already done 10 books. Yes, some of them are shorter, and also we've completely abandoned the TBR, so we are going to be having a big month next month trying to squeeze in the books that we aren't able to fit in this month. But it means that we're having fun doing Bookoplathon. We're able to do more rolls still. That was what we wanted to do, was to be able to roll a few more times. So I'm glad that we decided to abandon the TBR, because things did get very messy when we were filming that. If you like this video, please like it. If you'd like to subscribe, then I would be really grateful for that. Leave a comment down below if you've read any of these books and you agree or disagree with my thoughts. I'll link my socials in the description as well if you'd like to follow me on Twitter or Goodreads, or check out my blog, because I'll eventually be writing more in-depth things about all these books over there, but I'm just very lazy, so that's not happening for a while. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again at the end of the month to let you know what we read in the second half of September. Bye!